Today's next question comes from Lisa. Not the first time we've heard someone ask if President Trump can postpone the general election or if Congress has to get involved.
A short answer here. President Trump cannot just push back Election Day if he finds it to be politically inconvenient. This year's election set for Tuesday, November 3rd. Only Congress can change that. Even the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, speculated about the president delaying the election. Here's why he can't do it alone.
NBC News did a deep dive on this. The date of the general election has been fixed for the past 175 years. A few local elections have been disrupted, one after 9/11, another after a hurricane, and there was talk about postponing the 2004 presidential election. The Bush administration was worried about terrorism, but Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national security advisor at the time, said elections had always gone on, even in war times, and the 2004 election was held as scheduled. This Congress, with Democrats running the House, is unlikely to push back Election Day even if President Trump wants to. And even if both houses of Congress were to vote to change an Election Day and the president signed that legislation, their options are limited. The new Congress has to be sworn in on January 3rd, and the president's new term must begin January 20th. Those dates cannot be changed.